Hello and welcome to Deciding Iowa. I'm Dr. Shawn and Emily, cancer scientist, biochemistry professor, school board member, and a former House District 57 candidate.
Hi, and I'm Dr. Emily Bavers. I'm an OBGYN, mother of three, and a health advocate. No, the legislative season has not started yet, but Shawn and I had so much fun digging into these issues last spring that we decided to branch out to some ongoing issues in the state.
And so today we will introduce a 6-part series about water in Iowa. Over the course of these episodes, we will talk about or with 3 experts in different fields to help us define Iowa's water issues. And Emily, there are issues. We've heard a lot in the news this year about high nitrate loads in rivers and PFAS in drinking waters. Recent reports have found many hundreds of tested waterways in our state are unhealthy, and every summer we hear about more closed beaches for swimming and recreation. This affects Iowans in many ways, including health. So Emily, what are some of the health considerations for contaminated water?
Well, Iowans get drinking water from aquifers, through well systems, and surface water, like rivers. There are a number of potential contaminants to watch out for when consuming this water. Arsenate is a metabolic poison whose long-term consumption can be carcinogenic. Nitrates can cause blue baby syndrome through hypoxia and be converted to reactive nitrosamines linked to a variety of cancers. Lead is a well-known poison, especially in brain development. PFAS, or forever chemicals, have been linked to developmental effects, including to fetuses after exposure during pregnancy or postnatal development. Cancers like testicular and kidney cancers, liver lesions, and immune cell depression are also commonly known side effects of PFAS exposure.
Those are some serious consequences.
It's real.
Those contaminants can enter our drinking water from non-point sources such as farm fields, construction sites, and urban areas like lawns and golf courses, as well as point sources such as factory or wastewater treatment plant that discharges to waterways through a pipe. Iowans need to be able to trust the drinking water, trust that it will not make them sick.
Right.
So how can we reduce nutrient and contaminant release, clean our water, and lower our exposure? It's a social, economic, and health issue that we have to address. It's also an enormous issue for the state. So Emily, where are we starting?
Well, surprisingly, the starting place for water in Iowa is going to be the hypoxic zone, which is a region in the Gulf of Mexico where bottom water oxygen is 2 milligrams per liter or less. And this low level of oxygen cannot support marine life. This forces species to migrate and diminishes ecosystems. It has an upstream cause as well as downstream environmental effects.
And discovery of the hypoxic zone is going to lead us to our topic for today, how excess nutrients can be released into our water from non-point sources and our state's effort to reduce it. So our featured guest for today's conversation is Matt Helmers, an ISU professor and director of Iowa's Nutrient Reduction Program.
Super, let's go.
Hello, we are excited to be joined by Dr. Matt Helmers, director of Iowa Nutrient Research Center, dean, professor in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and a professor in the Department of Agriculture and Biosystems Engineering at Iowa State. Dr. Helmers' research areas include studies on the impact of nutrient management, cropping practices, drainage design and management, and strategic placement on buffer systems on nutrient export from agricultural landscapes. Welcome, Dr. Helmers.
Well, thanks for having me. Look forward to our conversation.
Well, we've heard a lot about the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy Program, but if you could tell us what exactly it is and who are the partners?
Yeah, so this started in actually October of 2010. Then Secretary of Agriculture Bill Northey was the co-chair of the Hypoxia Task Force. And 2008 Hypoxia Task Force Action Plan called for states to develop state-level nutrient reduction strategies for reducing nitrogen and phosphorus loading down the Mississippi River to the Gulf. So that one of the action items was for states to develop this. As a co-chair, he wanted to, for Iowa to be a leader in developing a strategy. So he started talking to the dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at that time, Dr. Wendy Winterstein, now the president of Iowa State University. And we convened in 2010 a science team with a charge of looking at kind of what practices could be effective and maybe what scale of implementation might we need to reach the nutrient reduction goals. And so from an EPA Science Advisory Board report, it called for a 45% reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus down the Mississippi River to the Gulf to reduce the size of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf. And so we went through a process of looking at the science. And so the partners of the nutrient reduction strategy are the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and then Iowa State University College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. There were kind of different components to the nutrient reduction strategy. There's a policy, a piece, kind of a framework for how it would be implemented. Then we had at Iowa State, we led this non-point source science assessment to look at what practices could be used and at what scale we might need them to reach that 45% reduction goal. And then another unique thing in Iowa is that the point sources, DNR really led the effort there. Point source pollution from some of our wastewater treatment plants and so forth, of which I think is really great that all those people were kind of at the table in talking about this. And so it was officially released in 2013. And so we're about 12 years into it. So that's kind of how it started, who the partners are, and then other states in the Mississippi River Basin. So there are 12 states that are part of the Hypoxia Task Force. Those out west are not officially, the Dakotas and Nebraska, Kansas, that would contribute water and some nutrients to the Missouri River are not a part of the Hypoxia Task Force.
What this is caused by is those excess nutrients that are getting into our water sources. And in that dead zone, aquatic life can't really thrive. And it's similar to how I talked about that excess nitrates in our water have health effects on humans, such as infertility, some birth defects, low hemoglobin or low oxygenation in infants particularly. And so it's all related. And so that's kind of the dead zone. That's what we're talking about here.
Yep.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Translation there from our scientists.
Yep. Those nutrients stimulate algae growth, and when that algae dies, it consumes oxygen, and so we have there's an area in the Gulf that's so low in dissolved oxygen that it's not supporting aquatic life. So
Perfect.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So you had mentioned non-point source, and when I think about non-point source, I think of farmers.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you could comment on how the program, since it started in 2013, has impacted farmers in the state of Iowa.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's impacted some a lot because they've implemented new practices. Some we're still trying to educate and get them to implement new practices. But one of the things the nutrient reduction strategy, our non-point source science assessment did, is it laid out kind of a menu of practices that farmers could use to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus from their land. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that nitrogen, primarily nitrate, is what we see in our streams, and phosphorus, they move in different pathways. The media nitrate runoff, but actually nitrate is primarily moved in water that moves through the soil profile. So it's water soluble, and so it's in water that's moving through the soil profile and then through some mechanism to a downstream water body, whether that be a stream or an aquifer. Phosphorus, the majority of that in most of our landscapes would be transported with surface water runoff. And so with that direct surface water runoff is where we're losing a lot of that phosphorus. As you look at that menu of practices, we've historically, with a lot of activities that have happened on farmland, we've implemented a lot of those practices that can help us with phosphorus. Things like reduced tillage, terraces, water and sediment control basins, things that really slow that water on the landscape. We've done a fair bit of those. So I think what's, kind of changed maybe in the last 12 years is there's been a lot more emphasis on those practices that can help us reduce nitrate delivery to downstream. How can we reduce that concentration of nitrate that's moving below the plant root zone? or can we intercept that water and treat it before it gets to the stream? So I think, for farmers in the last 12 years, they've heard a lot more about cover crops, which are an effective practice for nitrate reduction. And then probably in areas where we have a lot of tile drainage or artificial subsurface drainage, those farmers have heard a lot more about what we would have been termed kind of edge of field practices. So we're treating that drainage water before it gets to the stream. And so there are practices of a denitrification bioreactor, primarily right now, at least a wood chip trench that we route drainage water through, saturated buffer, probably one of my favorites, which is a wetland that we're siting to denitrify that water before releasing it downstream. And then we're kind of developing some new practices as well that we might be able to store and reuse some of that drainage water. I think farmers have heard more about these practices now, specifically on the nitrate reduction practices. I think, there are many of them that have implemented those practices, but we have so much more to do out on the landscape.
Yeah, what are some of the impediments for them to implement these practices?
Yeah, so some of them now I'm an ag engineer, not a social scientist, but some of the things I've seen in talking to farmers, there are things like cost. Cover crops, there may be a cost. Well, there is a cost associated with that. Some of it may be labor. That if to plant cover crops and to terminate cover crops is an additional operation for those landowners or those farmers, and so that's a bit. We have, I think, cultural barriers of this is kind of the way that I cropped this land for a generation, and so this is a change, and I think that so those are I guess are some of them. Some of the barriers, I think, too, are just, maybe not understanding the problem and the contribution. And so that's, I think there's an educational need on how do we educate people about that, even if we're doing the right things, we may be losing some nitrate, and how can we help with that? It is really important. And I think that another item that we, as we think about scaling this up, is that we need more resources out there. And I don't just mean financial resources always, but technical resources and, people to design these practices, people to maybe maintain them into the future. So I think about, designing wetlands, designing bioreactors, designing saturated buffers. I come from, a university and a program that we educate engineers. One of the things that I think is pretty cool is that we've seen more of our graduates in kind of our water resources area be able to stay in Iowa to design some of these practices. I think we need a lot more of them, but I think that's pretty great as a native Iowan to see people potentially stay in state and design these practices for the future is great. And as we think about, kind of our rural populations, again, I think about this, if we scale this up and do a lot more of these things on the landscape, we're going to need people out there to do that, to design those, to manage them, to site them, to work with the farmers on, how do they make them work on their landscape.
What's the scale of the typical farmer that you work with, or the typical operation? Are these small farms, large farms, a little bit of everything?
A little bit of everything. And education program, I'd say, for the farmers. Another partnership of Iowa State University, Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, and Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We've been around longer than the nutrient reduction strategy, but with that and other programs kind of deal with, smaller farms in some cases that are, maybe a little bit more diversified, but then also pretty large operators that have maybe, more than 1,000, up to 2,000 acres of corn and soybean land, and maybe some livestock as well. So, try to work with, I guess I try to work with all farmers, because as we think about it, anything that we do is we're going to need kind of all farmers engaged, not just small farms, not just big farms. We really need all individuals engaged in this.
Sure. So you talked a little bit about barriers, or what some of the impediments to integration were.
Yeah.
What about incentives? Are there incentives out there for people?
Yeah, there really are. And that's where, I think that we're pretty fortunate in Iowa that there have been a lot of financial resources dedicated at the state level to help with some of this, both from the standpoint of developing the infrastructure that's needed to deliver these programs, maybe being innovative in how we do it, and then providing incentives for farmers because, as I said, some of these cost money. And so, some incentives for farmers to implement them, whether that be a bioreactor, wetland, cover crops, that kind of thing. There's even some work in areas where, where maybe there's more opportunities for grazing land, that there's some grazing land program, maybe taking some of the agricultural land and putting it back into pasture land. So I think there's been a lot of those things happening, but certainly recognizing, we need to do a lot more as well.
Wow, there are a lot of resources and work being directed toward reducing nutrient release from non-point sources. But we are clearly still seeing high nutrient loads in our waterways.
Dr. Helmers mentioned many obstacles for effective program implementation. If we as a state are going to be successful in cleaning our water, we have to double down supporting nutrient reduction efforts, such as through fully funding monitoring our waterways, resource access, incentivization to adopt those practices, and when needed, force compliance. We can touch more on some of those in later episodes. But what should we talk about next, Emily?
Well, I think we need to know more about where our drinking water comes from, how much we have, and the efforts to monitor its condition.
Hey, that sounds like a great plan. Until then, thanks for joining us on Deciding Iowa.